All right, welcome back to another Wednesday live training where every single Wednesday I go live talking about all things that can make you a better man, a better husband, a better father, a better brother. And we cover all topics: health, wealth, mindset, relationships, communication, everything that's going to help you build an unshakable marriage and deeper connection with your kids. I am hell bent on a mission to do that because I suffered for 10 years really living an unconscious marriage and not leading my family the way they needed to be. And it caused a lot of turmoil, a lot of strife, but I was able to turn it all around in as quickly as 3 months. And then that has since compounded to 6 months, to 9 months, to 12 months, to now 2+ years where we're just living our best life. And I really started to understand that fatherhood is a skill, marriage is a skill. And when you understand these skills, you can level up your marriage. You can actually turn something around that felt like it was dead. I see it every day in the guys that I work with, and I saw it in my own self, and I'm on a mission to help others do that. Because when men start to realize that their relationship is not a place of conflict, but is actually the solution to getting them to where they want to be, everything will change. We will change so much that mental health, suicide, all those things will go away because that friction is actually, you're on the other side of growth. And I truly believe it, guys. So last couple of weeks, we're doing a series here on communication and how to control and how to win arguments. I think that's a big thing for guys. They want to be like, they feel like they just can't talk to their women. And if they do, it's always an argument. And how can they not only nullify that? And this isn't I'm not trying to manipulate women. I'm not trying to manipulate. And by the way, women can use this too. So if you're a woman and you're watching this and you want to learn more, you can watch this too and use it to your advantage. But really, when we start to look at how we are showing up in our relationship through the communication lens, it's all just how we frame things and there is a frame control that's being played out all the time. And when you start to understand this, you start to see the layer, you start to peel it back, well, then you can actually control the tempo of an argument or conversation or the narrative, and you can come out and win, negotiate, and you can go out and do this with sales and all that kind of stuff. So when you understand these frames. Now, just to be clear, this is part 3 of a 6-part series. So the last 2 sections, if you missed that, we talked about a couple of things. Your own personal inner frame. Like if you don't have that dialed in and you're not confident about who you are, well, then of course, anything I'm going to teach you today, which is really some brass tactics, and you're going to love this one today. The last 2 are really getting you right. Because if your foundation isn't set, there's no way I can teach you all these tactics and all these trainings. You're just going to go out and you're going to mess up because you as a person are not good. Okay. So the first one is all about that inner frame, like dialing you in, how your status matters, how you carry yourself, right? The second one was all negative emotions. And these, I think there were about 5 to 6, I think 5 negative emotions, big ones: fear, jealousy, inferiority, right? These are the ones that get in the way, and we get triggered right away by usually our spouse or our kids. Then we quickly go into this panic state, fight or flight. Our amygdala is activated. We're in an amygdala hijack, if you will. And our lower part of our brain is taking over instead of that executive higher part, the executive functioning part of the brain. And so we just don't do well. We don't show up. So those were the first 2. Go back and watch those if you haven't seen those. Now, today we're going to get into actual tactics. Like, how do you control the narrative in the relationship? Okay. And we're going to look at this, and it's going to be about how to master communication really at a deep, deep level. All right, let's first talk about then the role you play as a husband and a wife and why that's important. So your role at first, right? When you first start with your spouse, you're not a spouse, you're a boyfriend, you're a girlfriend, but then you transition to husband and wife. And so guess what? The roles change. And when roles change, what else changes? Expectations. And because we have different expectations for our spouse than we do our girlfriend, so the arguments that become more frequent when we do not communicate are change of expectations. So what tends to happen is arguments become more frequent when we don't communicate our change in these expectations. We start to evolve, but we don't explain that to our partner. And so they don't know that their partner's expectations have changed until, guess what? They have an argument. You ever notice though how often people are saying like, man, she really just changed since we got married. Like she's a completely different person. I hear women say this all the time too. Like as the second I said I do, he started doing all these other things. He wasn't like that. And men talk about this as well, right? And they talk about like where they reach this inner crisis point where they feel like nothing they do, nothing will ever change. And now their spouse wants to separate because they feel like this has been going on forever. Like he's never going to change. And that's because the bottom line is we've been living a different set of expectations for so long, and you haven't been meeting them. And unfortunately, your wife probably didn't express them the best way. They weren't expressed from Jump Street. And so you're like, hey, listen, you knew that when you met me. Those are the kind of things I hear all the time. Well, guess what, guys? We have to evolve. We have to be better. And we also have to develop new skills. And that's why you're here today, right? We got to develop these communication tactics so that we show up better for our spouse. And that you're not saying things like, what are you talking about? Like, it's always been this way. Like, you've changed now the expectation lens. And that could be true, but we've got to be better, right? We've got to sharpen up our skills. We've got to level up, right? And so for someone, when you think about when you're think about this, when you're dating someone, you don't really care as much that maybe how much money they earn or that they live this wild and adventurous lifestyle. But when you settle down and you get married, you may want now these certain things. Like, I expect my husband to make this amount of money. I expect them to start reading and not raving and going out to rave parties and being more responsible, right? That's just natural. So when we transition and evolve in our relationship, and we have to upgrade ourselves. And I've talked about that already, because otherwise the tension exists and then you feel like you can't be with this person, right? And just remember, it's always going to feel uncomfortable in the beginning when you're doing these changes, because your brain is getting used to having to play a different role. And much of this behavior in the beginning is going to feel forced. You might even find that you feel less patient for them than when you would when someone like you just met, or you just, or if this was the role they normally had. So let's talk about arguments. Now, when you're in a relationship and you're fighting, the real conflict is actually unstated, because the fight revolves around the symptom rather than the real inciting incident or reason. I'm going to repeat that. That is so important. So just remember that when you're in a relationship and the fight is happening, you're in an argument, the real conflict, the actual argument, it's not about what you think. It's actually unstated, and it revolves around something else that you probably have no idea about. And much of the time, people have different tactics to avoid addressing the real reason they're arguing, because doing so would make them vulnerable. So they're not going to do that. Sometimes also what we'll see is both parties, they don't even know the real reason and what's at the center of the conflict. So sometimes it's actually impossible to actually bring up the real issue that's causing the conflict, even though, guess what? You and your spouse, I guarantee, because I used to do this, you get caught up in these revolving, recurring, same arguments, same cycles. Once a week, we're probably going to argue like this. She's going to do this. I'm going to go regress. We're not going to talk for a week, and then things will get made up and we'll come back. That's how my life used to be. So even acknowledging it, though, once the underlying issue is brought up, it could make someone vulnerable and defensive, right? So you never want to bring these things up during the heat of the argument. You got to start learning these things now. You got to learn these skills. And I think a lot of us try to do it at the heat of the argument because it's being addressed for maybe the first time, but it's the worst time to actually address the real conflict of the argument while the argument is happening. I'm sorry. Don't ever address what is the real issue in the argument in real time. You're gonna have to do that at a later time. So again, here's the number one thing you don't do when you argue with your wife. And this sounds counterintuitive. Do not bring up the real issues of why you are fighting during a fight. Because the goal of a fight isn't to solve the problem, but to dominate the other individual and gain compliance. And when a person is in a belligerent state, they're incapable of listening to any position other than their own. So if you try to solve the problem during these explosive states, you might frame your grievance in a way that it's not even palatable. Or you might have your legitimate concern. It's going to be treated in a disrespectful way. And so there's 4 tactics that people use to keep the fight from moving to a place where a resolution could actually happen. You guys are probably familiar with these. The 4 are this: violence, crying, silence, and removal. And I'm going to explain each form, and then I'm going to teach you how to attack each frame. So if this person shows up this way, you're going to know how to deal with it. Now, violence, obviously, we know there's physical violence, but this also includes screaming, throwing things, knocking down furniture, punching walls, cursing, etc., all of these kind of things. Now, why would someone do this? Why would they behave this way? It's simple. They want to silence you with their force. And most likely, this person, they've become so insecure and afraid about whatever was brought up that they use violence to annihilate your respect and they demand compliance. Now, if someone is acting like this is what you're going to do. You're just going to remove yourself and you're going to leave. That's it. Because there's no way for you to actually win this argument. So just leave. Now, another powerful tactic that we see people utilize is crying. Okay. And be very careful with the criers because this is another tactic that's often used. And people that cry, they're usually crying because they're overwhelmed, right? But criers use it to stop themselves from being held responsible for their actions. And those are the ones you really want to watch out for, right? The criers, they're going to use their tears to stop a fight when they're being asked hard questions or they're being asked something that would be a bit of an inconvenience. And this pattern of behavior is childish. And it's likely a conditioned response that they use to avoid responsibility. So what do you do when someone begins crying? This is what you're going to do. You just stop talking and you wait until they're finished. Because anything you say is only going to further or encourage that emotional state. So be ready because you're going to hear things like, you don't care. Why are you always doing this to me? And I need you guys to resist that urge to want to console them or respond to anything that they are saying. Here's what you're going to do. You're just going to wait patiently until they've exhausted themselves. Because once they stop crying, there's only one of three things that can possibly happen. Number one, either they're going to be willing to carry on with the dialogue and you can actually begin having an honest conversation, honest communication, or two other things are going to happen, which is silence and removal, which we're going to talk about next. Those are the only other two options that's going to happen. And we know that famous silent treatment comes up, right? So let's talk about that. How do you handle that? Because that's the next step that's going to happen. Well, people that go silent, this was my go-to. I would just be silent. I would remove myself from everything because I didn't want to get in those tough conversations. I didn't want to be vulnerable. So people that go silent or they remove themselves from conversations when things get tough, they have actually no intent of listening to your position. They just shut down. So if they do re-engage you, it's because they're actually expecting your terms to change due to the validation vacuum that's been created. And so I'm going to talk about what does this validation vacuum mean in a second, but you do not want to allow them to do that. Because now all of a sudden they're in because they're expecting you to actually change. And people are malleable, people do change. So you have to be careful about that. I'm going to talk about that later as well. But if someone does silent treatment for days or weeks, just make it clear to them that you will stop the relationship if this kind of behavior continues. Because when someone is doing silent treatment, you want to just treat it like a game. Okay? Don't address your frustration with their silence. It's only going to embolden them and they know now they're winning and they're going to keep the silent treatment going. But here's the cool thing. Silent treatment is actually, it's one of the easiest frames or forms for us to change. So that's a good thing. If someone's throwing things and acting violently or crying, a lot of times those are all learned behaviors and they become very conditioned and hardwired into their system. And now they just automatically happen for most people. So it's going to take us time to do a lot of rewiring. But with silent treatment, it's typically a more conscious and kind of type of behavior. It's a conscious choice they're making. And so it's a lot easier for us to actually break that habit, okay? The easiest thing to do once a fight begins is to simply repeatedly state your position. The easiest thing to do once a fight begins is just to repeatedly state your position. Do not change your tone. Do not change your rhythm. Do not respond to them mocking you for repeating the same things over and over again. Because when people are losing the fight, they'll often make it something about something else, right? We see this often. They make these ad hominem attacks. They start attacking your character. And it has nothing to do with the actual argument. And so what you're going to say is, that might be true, but what we're talking about right now is blank. Redirect them. Acknowledge that what they're bringing up, and you can do it in a very, notice my tone. My tone is nice. I'm not angry about it. I'm really emotionless, right? Hey, that might be, yeah, I know that might be true. I totally get it. But what we're talking about right now is this, right? Now, let's talk about the validation vacuum, because this is another key piece in the frame and scope of a conversation or an argument. And this is really, really key. And I mentioned it a little bit earlier in this presentation. Now, a validation vacuum, this is where a person who regularly validates you all of a sudden stops. Now, if you're like me, I'm a recovering nice guy. I love to be known as being significant, validated. I know I matter. I know my wife loves me. And when that stops, oh boy, I start to crumble. And we see this a lot with the nice guys out there. If you're a nice guy out there, I get you, but we got some work to do, and I can help you because I've had to recover myself. Now, when somebody stops validating you, typically what happens is you're going to end up experiencing a myriad of emotions, right? Typically ranging from anger to sadness. And we talked about this in our first two videos. This destroys your frame. If you can't manage your negative emotions, you're done. Like, you're done, straight up. So when someone stops validating, you're going to end up probably experiencing anger, probably experiencing sadness, and this will destroy your frame and any control you have moving forward. So you got to be aware of that, and you got to be very careful if you fit that nice guy description, because that is probably a repeatable thing that happens to you. Now, many of the narratives that come out of this validation vacuum, they only exist because you need to justify why you feel the negative emotions that you're experiencing. And that's why a lot of times you'll see guys and women to go and seek their friends, and they'll go tell them everything that's happening in the relationship so that their friend can validate back to them, oh yeah, you're totally right. Like, dump her. She's such a B, and then women are doing the same thing. So two big things that you want to keep in mind, guys, or ladies, if you're listening to this. Don't re-engage someone until you've actually cycled through the emotions that are negative for the frame. So anger, jealousy, fear, these are all horrible negotiating bases to start with. And they might actually cause you to act in a way that's not in your best interest. You're probably going to lose in the negotiation. Second, don't expect them to have like a particular emotional state that you want them to have. Don't expect them to be all of a sudden, just lovey-dovey and like ready to apologize to you. A lot of times that what destroys our frame too is we have this expectation effect where we expect our spouses to now respond a certain way because now we're responding a certain way. You don't want to do that. That's going to destroy you as well. And you guys know that. You've been there many times. Many people, what happens is they end up getting themselves upset again because they don't feel like that person is sorry enough, or they don't feel bad enough about what they've done. And so guess what? The argument begins all over again. So you got to decide in advance whether the issue that's being discussed, is this a deal breaker? Because if you know in advance, you're going to have a stronger frame. You don't want to think about this as the argument's ensuing or as you're getting into it, because that's just too much for you to process and you're not going to be ready. So you got to remember that most people's demands, they are malleable and they're rarely static. And just think about this. If governments can change laws, people can change positions. It's that simple, guys. I don't care what they tell you, like, I want a divorce, I want to get separated. That doesn't mean anything to me. And I've seen it happen. I've seen us reverse divorces. I've seen us reverse all kinds of decisions that I'm absolutely like going to do this. Think about times you've negotiated, you bought cars and they told you this was the price and it all worked out. I can tell you how I got 50% off on my insurance from a car dealer recently. I purchased a car and I got 50% off because I knew what I was doing with some of these tactics that I'm explaining to you guys. So just because he told me that was the price, he was able to drop it 50%. 50%. Now, we're not talking like a little bit of a deal. It dropped 50%. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there was even more room to go. Maybe I'm the sucker still, and maybe that's true. But remember that a change in context can make a formerly non-negotiable term now negotiable. And here's what I mean. Here's the example. How do you get a king to exchange his crown for a glass of water? Simple. Deprive him of water. It's that simple. Sometimes people, they're going to continue to argue after the fact because they don't want to feel like they lost face, right? They don't want to feel like they were wrong. It hurts to look inward and actually admit I might be part of the problem. And so if you actually suspect this, always, this is key, you're going to love this, pay them a compliment, right? Acknowledge them for what they've done and then reiterate your point. So it's going to look something like this. I admire your intelligence and your persistence on this point, but right now, I don't know if we're really understanding one another. Let's take some time and let our emotions die down. By giving that person a compliment before you disagree, they will accept one of your assertions. So in general, once someone has accepted one of your statements as being true, it makes them more likely to accept the other assertions as also being true. I'm going to repeat that. By giving them a compliment before you disagree, they will accept one of your assertions. And in general, most people, once they've accepted one thing as being true, it's just natural for their brain to associate the other one and accept everything as true. So by disengaging, here's another piece. By disengaging, you put them in the validation vacuum where they are more likely to be self-reflective about that argument. So key. Go back and watch this one multiple times. You're going to love that. Now, let's get into the context of an argument, and then I'm going to start wrapping things up. Our physiology influences our emotions. I've talked about this before, but oftentimes what will come up with an emotional experience to justify your physiological state. So just make sure that when you get into arguments that you're well fed and you're well rested. And I mean, just a funny thing to kind of note is that we see this typically, homicides in every major city, they always spike and go up during the hottest days of summer. So our physiological state can motivate us to do the unthinkable. So just take that into consideration. I talk this about all the time. Like, that's why it's so important to work out every day, because you feel a certain way and your body stores emotions and feelings. And if you're feeling not a certain way, you're not feeling confident, well, move your body. And we can go into that even more, but I don't want to get too long to that. That'll be a whole nother, that'll be another 2-hour conversation. Now let's get into point of view, because this is another critical aspect and a lens to look at when you're attacking an argument. If you can access someone's point of view, that's a game changer, okay? And it's going to increase your success in arguments and in conversations. And it's going to help you, it's going to help them better accept your frame and everything that you're trying to evoke. So understanding where they're coming from, though, that's critical. Understanding their perspective, being empathetic. Are they hungry? Like, what's their past like? How can I say it? How can I say what I'm trying to say in a way that gets them aligned to my frame so that they see it now as a benefit to them? And when you start to feel like an argument is inevitable, I want you to start reflecting on their point of view, okay? So first, you're going to start looking at maybe some of the explicit incentives. And a great example is like, if your teenage son's pestering you to buy him a car. Like, he doesn't want the car because he just wants a brand new car. He wants a car because a car equals freedom. It gets him out of the house more, not just to have a car. So remember, in arguments and in conversations, there's always a good reason, and then there's the real reason. Your job is to find out the real reason, okay? Always know, and they talk about this in Taoism, it's important to know your opponent, right? Before you even engage with them. You need to know them better than you know yourself. So always reflect on, like, who has authority over them in their life? Like, what are the authors that they read? What are the therapists that they think would say about the situation? What would their partner want? Think about all these things. Because when you start to find out their authority figures and who, like, rules over them, rules in quotes, both living or dead, it's a really powerful it's really a powerful way to understand them better and how and what they do and what makes them tick, right? You almost, like, seriously, when you go deep in this, you want to lose yourself in the process. And and I talked about this, you want to become your opponent, right? And we're talking like it's like a chess match, like an MMA fight. And it doesn't need to be that way. Like, your wife is not your opponent. I don't want you to think that way. But when you get into this level of relationship, right, with your marriage, most guys don't think about these things. They don't think about the dynamics and the skills that it takes that I'm giving you in these conversations. And so the fact of the matter is, I teach you all this stuff, and most guys are just going to watch this video and go on to the next and not even do any of the work. And that's the hilarious thing. They want things to change, but they won't put in the work. Like, oh, you're telling me I have to go through this 5-step process to learn how to communicate, to change my marriage? Yeah, that's what I'm telling you. Like, that's what you got to do. Are you going to do it? And no, because you've never put that much attention or intention into your marriage and into your family. So how can you expect it to get better? I'm giving you the skills, but will you do it? A lot of guys won't. And it's not easy, guys, because when you do this work, you're probably going to bruise your ego a little bit. You're going to find some things out about you that you don't like. You might even assume that you and your wife value the same thing. And the fact of the matter is you don't. And you're going to get very clear on that. But the better you get at this, you're going to be able to start predicting things before they happen. You're getting proactive. You're not going to get caught off guard by things that they bring up. And that is going to start with your empathy for them, your ability to understand them at their core better, understanding their point of view. Okay. And don't be afraid to change your point of view. You know, I've changed my point of view many times, and I am not afraid to admit it. And I think that's a key too, being flexible, being malleable and on your own point of view. And it's going to show them that you actually took the time to understand them. You took the time to feel like what it's like to be them. And that's what a lot of them want to see. They want to be validated. They want to be heard. They want to be empathized. They want to be seen. And I'm going to leave you with a quote by Kim Krizan, which is, when we communicate with one another and we feel that we've connected and we think we're understood, I think we have a feeling of an almost spiritual communion. And that feeling might be transient, but I think it's what we live for. Boom. Guys, I hope this was a powerful and impactful training this week. I mean, we went deep on the tools and like everything you need to know. There's so much more to this. I'm already looking at the time. I went 20 minutes. A lot of times these trainings are just 10, 15, 20 at the tops, but I've gone past that today because there's just so much I wanted to cover. And this was a juicy one. So we're going to continue. This is part 3 of part 6. So stay tuned for the next part of these series of how to frame, control, win arguments, and negotiate better and be a better leader, be a better father, be a better husband. If you're interested in learning more about my free community or some of my paid community, I have an app that is dropping in the next week that is going to level dads up and build a community within. If you guys are interested in learning any more about that, just shoot me a line, comment, and I'll get you all the details. Excited to continue this journey with you guys and level up.